The red dust of Chiricahua Prime swirled around Harold Finch's boots as he walked back from his small garden. The twin suns were sinking below the horizon and casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Harold was 82 years old and his back ached from the day's work, but he felt satisfied with the vegetables he had managed to grow in the harsh alien soil. He lived alone now and had lived alone for 10 years since his wife Margaret passed away. Their daughter Claire lived far away on Earth and rarely visited this remote colony world. Harold did not mind the solitude much anymore because he had his routines and his memories and his garden to keep him company. The settlement of New Mesa lay about 3 miles to the east, and Harold could see its lights beginning to flicker on as evening approached. He had moved out here to the edge of human territory 15 years ago when he retired from his work as a xenobiologist. Margaret had loved the peace and quiet of the frontier, and after she died, Harold could not bring himself to leave the home they had built together. The homestead was simple, with solar panels on the roof and a water purifier that hummed constantly as it extracted moisture from the air. The land around him was mostly bare, except for the strange purple grass that grew in patches and the tall rock formations that jutted up from the ground like ancient sentinels. Harold was thinking about what to prepare for dinner when he heard a sound near his water purifier. It was a soft groan and almost like a wounded animal. He stopped walking and listened carefully. The sound came again, and this time it was clearly a voice and clearly in distress. Harold set down his basket of vegetables and walked slowly toward the purifier. His eyes were not as sharp as they once were, but he could make out a shape on the ground near the metal structure. As he got closer, Harold felt his heart begin to race. Lying in the dirt was a child, and not a human child, but an Apache. The boy could not have been more than 12 years old by human standards, and he was badly hurt. Harold had studied the Apache people for most of his career, but he had never been this close to one before. The indigenous species of Chiricahua Prime were tall and lean with copper-colored skin that had a faint shimmer to it. Their eyes were large and dark, and their features were sharp and elegant. This boy had the same characteristics, but his face was twisted in pain and his chest showed terrible plasma burns that had melted through his clothing. Harold knelt beside the child, and his old medical training kicked in immediately. He could see that the boy's left leg was broken and bent at an unnatural angle. The plasma burns were serious but not immediately fatal if treated quickly. The boy's breathing was shallow and rapid, and his skin felt hot to the touch with fever. Harold knew that he should probably contact the colony authorities or try to find the boy's people, but he also knew that moving the child in this condition could kill him. The Apache tribes had very little contact with human settlers, and most of that contact had been tense at best. Taking one of their children could be seen as an act of war or kidnapping, but leaving him here to die was not something Harold could do. He made his decision quickly. Harold slipped his arms under the boy's body as gently as he could and lifted him up. The child was lighter than expected, and his eyes fluttered open for just a moment. Those dark eyes looked at Harold with fear and confusion before closing again. Harold carried him inside the homestead and laid him on the bed in the spare room that had once been Claire's when she was young. The room still had her old drawings on the walls and a faded quilt that Margaret had sewn by hand. Harold went to his storage closet and pulled out his old medical kit. It was outdated by modern standards, but it had everything he needed for basic emergency care. He cut away the boy's burned clothing carefully and examined the wounds more closely under the bright light of his desk lamp. The plasma burns had cauterized themselves, which meant less blood loss but more tissue damage. He cleaned the burns with sterile solution and applied regenerative gel that he kept for emergencies. The gel would help, but the boy needed better care than Harold could provide here. Next, Harold turned his attention to the broken leg. He had set broken bones before during his field research years, and the process had not changed much. He found 2 straight pieces of metal from his workshop and used them as splints. The boy whimpered in his unconscious state as Harold carefully straightened the leg and bound it securely. He gave the child a dose of pain medication from his kit and covered him with blankets because the fever was making him shiver despite the heat of his skin. For the next several hours, Harold sat beside the bed and monitored the boy's condition. He used his old medical scanner to check for internal bleeding and was relieved to find none. The scanner showed that the boy's physiology was similar enough to human that most of his medicines would work without causing harm. Harold prepared a simple broth from vegetables in his garden that he knew were safe for Apache biology based on his research. He had spent decades studying their culture and biology, always hoping that one day humans and Apache could find common ground. As the night deepened, Harold managed to get some of the broth into the boy's mouth. The child swallowed reflexively, and Harold took that as a good sign. He pulled a chair close to the bed and settled in to keep watch. His mind wandered to Margaret and what she would have said about this situation. She always believed that kindness was never wasted, and that understanding between species was possible if people tried hard enough. Harold had always been more cautious, but tonight he found himself agreeing with her philosophy. The boy stirred several times during the night and called out in the Apache language. Harold did not understand most of the words, but he recognized the tone of someone calling for family. He spoke softly in English, telling the child that he was safe and that everything would be all right. Whether the boy understood or not, Harold could not tell, but his voice seemed to have a calming effect. As the first sun began to rise, Harold realized that he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He had taken an Apache child into his home and treated his wounds, and now the boy's people would be looking for him. Harold did not know what the morning would bring, but he knew that he had done the right thing, and that was enough for now. The night had been long, and Harold's eyes felt heavy with exhaustion, but he refused to sleep while the boy needed monitoring. Every hour he checked the child's temperature and pulse and wound dressings. The fever had been high throughout the night, and several times Harold worried that it might climb too high for the boy's system to handle. He kept cool cloths on the child's forehead and changed them regularly as they grew warm. The medical scanner showed that the internal systems were stable, but the body was fighting hard against infection from the burns. Around 3 a.m, the boy had begun to thrash in the bed and cry out more frequently. Harold held his hand and spoke in gentle tones, even though the child could not understand his words. There was something universal about comfort that transcended language, and Harold hoped that his presence alone might ease the boy's distress. He sang an old song that Margaret used to hum while she worked in the garden, and the melody seemed to calm the young Apache somewhat. When dawn finally broke, through the windows, Harold prepared more broth, and this time he added some protein powder that was designed to be species neutral. The boy needed strength if he was going to heal properly. Harold heated the mixture until it was warm but not hot and sat on the edge of the bed. The child's eyes were moving beneath his eyelids, which meant he was closer to consciousness now. Harold waited patiently, and after a few minutes those dark eyes opened and looked directly at him. The fear in the boy's face was immediate and intense. He tried to sit up quickly, but pain shot through his body and he gasped. Harold raised his hands in a peaceful gesture and spoke softly. The boy did not understand the words, but he seemed to recognize that Harold was trying to communicate something non-threatening. Still, the child's eyes darted around the room looking for escape routes, and his breathing became rapid and shallow again. Harold worried that panic might undo all the healing that had happened during the night. Slowly and deliberately, Harold pointed to the boy's bandaged chest and then to his own medical kit. He made gentle gestures as if wrapping bandages, and then pointed to the regenerative gel on the nightstand. The boy watched him carefully, and Harold could see the wheels turning in that young mind, trying to understand what this old human wanted. Harold then pointed to the broth and made a drinking motion, bringing his hand to his mouth. The boy's eyes followed the gesture, and Harold could see hunger war with suspicion in his expression. Harold stood up slowly and backed away from the bed, giving the child space. He set the bowl of broth on the nightstand within the boy's reach, and then sat down in the chair across the room. He wanted to show that he was not going to force anything, and that the boy could make his own choices. For several minutes they simply looked at each other in silence. Harold kept his face neutral and non-threatening, and gradually he saw some of the tension leave the boy's shoulders. The child reached for the bowl with a shaking hand and brought it to his lips. He sniffed it first, which Harold thought was smart, and then took a small sip. The boy's eyes widened slightly, and he took another larger sip. He was clearly very hungry, and the broth disappeared quickly. When the bowl was empty, the boy set it down and looked at Harold again. This time there was less fear in his eyes and more confusion. Harold decided to try something different. He pulled out his datapad and called up some simple images. He showed the boy a picture of the human settlement of New Mesa, and then a picture of an Apache village that he had taken from a distance years ago during his research. The boy leaned forward with interest when he saw his own people's homes. Harold then showed pictures of the local wildlife, including the dangerous sand prowlers that hunted in the desert. When the image of a sand prowler appeared on the screen, the boy's eyes went wide, and he pointed to his own wounds and then to the creature. Understanding dawned on Harold's face. The boy had been attacked by a sand prowler, and that explained the plasma burns in the broken leg. Those creatures were massive and aggressive with natural armor that could deflect most weapons. For a child to survive an encounter with one at all was remarkable. Harold nodded and made a fierce face while gesturing to the image and then pointed to the boy with an expression of respect. The child seemed surprised that Harold understood, and a tiny smile flickered across his face before pain reminded him of his injuries. Harold checked the boy's bandages and was pleased to see that the regenerative gel was working. The burns were already beginning to form new tissue, and the redness around the edges had decreased. He applied more gel and rewrapped the wounds with fresh bandages. The boy watched him work and did not flinch away this time. Harold also checked the splint on the broken leg and adjusted it slightly to ensure proper alignment. The boy winced but did not cry out. As the morning progressed, Harold prepared a proper breakfast for both of them. He made scrambled eggs from powder and heated some bread that he had baked 2 days earlier. He brought 2 plates to the spare room and sat in the chair while the boy ate from the bed. It was the first time in 10 years that Harold had shared a meal with another person in his home, and he found that he had missed the simple companionship of eating together. The boy ate slowly and carefully as if he was not quite sure what to make of the human food, but hunger won out over caution. After breakfast, Harold used his data pad to show the boy more images. He pulled up pictures of Margaret and told stories about her, even though the child could not understand the words. Harold found that he wanted to talk, and the boy seemed content to listen to the sound of his voice. He showed pictures of Claire when she was young and pictures of the research he had done on Apache culture. The boy seemed fascinated by the images of his own people, especially the ones showing traditional ceremonies and crafts. Harold then did something that surprised himself. He called up a basic language program on his datapad that he had created years ago when he was actively studying the Apache. It had simple words and phrases in both English and Apache. He pointed to the word for water in Apache and said it out loud. His pronunciation was probably terrible, but the boy's eyes lit up with recognition. The child repeated the word in his own language and then pointed to Harold and waited. Harold understood. He said the English word for water, and the boy repeated it carefully. His accent was thick, but the effort was clear. They went through several more words together, and Harold felt a warmth in his chest that he had not felt in a long time. This was communication, and this was understanding, and this was the bridge that Margaret had always believed was possible. The boy pointed to himself and said a word in Apache. Harold listened carefully and repeated it. The child nodded and said it again more slowly. It sounded like Little Hawk, but Harold was not sure if that was the exact translation. He pointed to himself and said his own name. The boy tried to repeat it and managed something close to Harold. They both smiled at the attempt. As the day wore on, Harold continued to care for Little Hawk, and they continued their language lessons. The boy was bright and picked up English words quickly. Harold's Apache was much slower, but Little Hawk seemed patient with him. They communicated through gestures and drawings and simple words, and slowly a friendship began to form between the old man and the young warrior. Harold woke from a brief nap in his chair to find Little Hawk watching him with curious eyes. The boy's fever had broken during the morning, and his color looked better, though he was still weak and in pain. Harold smiled at him and checked his watch. It was early afternoon, and he had slept for maybe 2 hours. His old body was protesting the lack of proper rest, but there was too much to do to worry about. Comfort now. He went to the kitchen to prepare lunch, and while he was there, he happened to glance out the window toward the hills. Something caught his eye, and he stopped moving. There on the ridgeline about a mile away were figures, and they were not moving like animals. Harold's heart began to beat faster, and he went to his closet to retrieve his old binoculars. They were military grade from his younger days and still worked perfectly despite their age. Through the lenses, Harold could see them clearly. Apache scouts, and at least a dozen of them, spread across the ridge. They wore the traditional thermal reflective cloaks that made them shimmer in the heat, and they were clearly searching for something. Harold lowered the binoculars and took a deep breath. They were looking for Little Hawk, and it was only a matter of time before they found his homestead. The question was, what would happen when they did? Harold returned to the spare room where Little Hawk was trying to sit up. The boy had heard Harold moving around and wanted to know what was happening. Harold helped him settle back against the pillows and then sat down in the chair. He pulled out his data pad and called up an image of Apache warriors. He pointed to the image and then pointed toward the hills. Little Hawk's eyes widened and he spoke rapidly in his own language. Harold did not understand all the words, but he caught enough to know the boy was worried. Using their simple shared vocabulary and gestures, Harold tried to explain the situation. The boy's people were searching for him and they would find him soon. Little Hawk became agitated and tried to get out of bed despite his injuries. He kept saying words that sounded like he was telling Harold to run or hide. Harold gently pushed him back down and shook his head. He was too old to run, and where would he go in the desert? Besides, running would make him look guilty of something he had not done. Little Hawk grabbed Harold's hand and spoke with urgency. Even without understanding the exact words, Harold could hear the fear in the boy's voice. He was afraid for Harold, and that touched the old man's heart. This child who had been terrified of him just hours ago was now worried about his safety. Harold squeezed the boy's hand and tried to project calm confidence that he did not entirely feel. The afternoon passed slowly, and Harold kept watch through his windows. The scouts on the ridge had disappeared, but he knew they had not gone far. They were likely reporting back to their war party and planning their next move. Harold used the time to write a letter to Claire on his datapad. He explained everything that had happened and told her that he loved her. He set the message to send automatically if he did not cancel it within 24 hours. It was morbid, perhaps, but also practical. He also sent a message to the colony administration informing them of the situation. He was careful to explain that he had acted to save a child's life, and that he hoped this would not cause conflict between humans and Apache. The response came back within an hour from Governor Hayes, who said that they were monitoring the situation and preparing response protocols. Harold knew what that meant. If the Apache attacked his homestead, the colony would respond with force, and that could spark the war that everyone had been trying to avoid for 30 years. Harold went back to Little Hawk and found the boy, watching the windows nervously. He sat down and pulled out his datapad again. This time he showed Little Hawk pictures of Margaret and told him about his wife using simple words and gestures. He explained that she had always believed that people of different worlds could understand each other if they tried. Margaret had spent years working with Harold on his research, and she had been the one to encourage him to keep studying Apache culture even when it seemed hopeless. Little Hawk listened and seemed to understand, at least the emotion behind the words, if not every detail. He spoke about his own family using the simple English he had learned. His father was someone important, and Harold gathered that the man was a chief or leader of some kind. His mother had died when he was very young, and his father had raised him with the help of the tribe. He had been on some kind of test or trial when the sand prowler attacked him, and he felt shamed that he had failed. Harold tried to explain that surviving was not failure, and that being alive was what mattered. The boy seemed unconvinced but appreciated the attempt. They sat together in companionable silence for a while, and Harold found himself thinking about how strange life could be. 2 days ago, he had been alone and resigned to spending his remaining years in quiet isolation. Now he was caring for an alien child and facing possible death at the hands of a warrior culture, yet he felt more alive than he had in years. As evening approached, Harold saw more movement in the hills. This time it was not scouts, but larger groups moving into position. He counted at least 50 warriors that he could see, and he knew there were probably many more hidden from view. They were forming a perimeter around his homestead and tightening it slowly. Harold had studied Apache tactics during his research, and he recognized the pattern. They were not rushing in because they wanted to assess the situation first and determine if their child was safe. Harold prepared dinner for both of them, and they ate while watching the sunset through the window. The twin suns painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, and for a moment Harold forgot about the danger surrounding them. Little Hawk seemed equally captivated by the beauty, and they sat together in peaceful appreciation of the natural world. After dinner, Harold helped Little Hawk use the bathroom and change into some of Claire's old clothes that were small enough to fit him. The boy's own clothes had been too damaged to save. Harold also changed the bandages again and was pleased to see continued improvement in the wounds. The broken leg would take weeks to heal properly, but the burns were responding well to treatment. Night fell, and Harold saw the campfires begin to appear in the hills around his property. He counted them carefully and felt his stomach tighten. There were not 50 warriors out there or even 100. The fires stretched in a wide circle that must have contained hundreds, if not thousands, of Apache. They had not just sent a search party for Little Hawk. They had sent an army. Harold understood now the weight of what he had done. Little Hawk was not just any child. He was the son of a chief and possibly the heir to leadership of his people. Taking him or harming him would be seen as an act of war against the entire Apache nation. Even though Harold's intentions had been pure, the situation had spiraled far beyond his control. He sat with Little Hawk and taught him a song that Margaret used to sing. It was a simple melody about hope and stars and finding your way home. The boy's voice was rough, but he learned the words and tune quickly. They sang it together several times, and Harold felt tears prick his eyes. Whatever happened tomorrow, at least they had this moment of connection and understanding. Little Hawk eventually fell asleep from exhaustion and pain medication, but Harold stayed awake watching the fires in the darkness. He counted them over and over, and each time he reached the same impossible number. There were at least 1,000 warriors surrounding his home, and by dawn they would come for their child and for him. Harold did not sleep at all that night. He sat in his chair with his old military binoculars and watched the campfires burn in the hills around his homestead. Through his thermal scanner, he could see the heat signatures of warriors moving in organized patterns and setting up what looked like command posts at strategic points. They were not a mob, but a disciplined military force, and that both impressed and frightened him. These were not savages, as some colonists called them, but a sophisticated civilization with their own honor, codes, and traditions. Around midnight, Harold sent the cancellation code for his message to Claire and then wrote a new one. He told her about Little Hawk and about the song they had sung together. He explained that he was not afraid to die because he had lived a good life, and that he hoped his actions might somehow lead to peace between their peoples. He told her he loved her and that he was proud of the woman she had become. This message he set to send at dawn regardless of what happened. Little Hawk woke several times during the night, calling out in his sleep. Each time Harold went to him and spoke softly until the boy calmed down. The child was dreaming, and not all the dreams were pleasant. Harold wondered what kind of life Little Hawk had lived and what he had seen in his few years. The Apache were warriors by culture and tradition, and their children were raised to be strong and brave. Yet this boy had shown kindness and concern for an old, human stranger, and that spoke to something deeper than cultural conditioning. As the hours passed, Harold found himself thinking about all the research he had done on Apache culture. He had studied their language and their customs and their history going back hundreds of years before they came to Chiricahua Prime. The Apache were originally from another world that had been destroyed by environmental collapse. They had migrated here searching for a new home and had found this harsh desert planet that reminded them of their ancestral lands. They had thrived here, developing technology that worked in harmony with the environment rather than against it. When humans arrived 30 years ago, there had been hope for cooperation. But territorial disputes and cultural misunderstandings had created tension. The Apache saw the human colonists as invaders who did not respect the land. The humans saw the Apache as obstacles to progress who held too much territory for too few people. Several small conflicts had erupted over the years, and lives had been lost on both sides. A fragile peace had been maintained mostly because neither side wanted full-scale war. But that peace was built on mutual avoidance rather than mutual understanding. Harold had always believed that real peace required more. It required people to see each other as individuals rather than representatives of their species. It required acts of trust and kindness that crossed cultural boundaries. Margaret had believed this too, and together they had worked to document Apache culture not as curiosities, but as a legitimate civilization worthy of respect. Yet despite decades of work, Harold had never managed to make direct contact with the Apache people. They had avoided him, and he had respected their distance. Until now. Around 4 a.m, Harold made coffee and sat at his kitchen table. His hands were steady despite everything, and he took that as a good sign. He was not a brave man by nature, but he had lived long enough to know that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. He had saved Little Hawk because it was the right thing to do, and he would face the consequences of that choice because running was not an option. He thought about what he would say when the Apache came. He had practiced some phrases in their language, but his accent was terrible, and he might accidentally insult them. Perhaps it would be better to let his actions speak for themselves. Little Hawk was alive and healing, and that was the only defense Harold had. He had treated the boy with respect and kindness and asked for nothing in return. If that was not enough, then nothing he could say would matter. At 5 in the morning, Little Hawk woke and immediately sensed the tension in the air. He called for Harold, and the old man came to sit with him. The boy spoke rapidly in Apache, and Harold caught words that sounded like questions. He showed Little Hawk the view from the window where the campfires still burned, and the boy's face went pale. He understood now the scale of what was happening, and he became very agitated. Little Hawk grabbed Harold's arm and spoke urgently, mixing Apache and English words together. He kept saying that Harold should run and hide and that he would tell his people the truth. Harold shook his head gently and explained as best he could that running would make things worse. He was an old man, and he would not get far in the desert. More importantly, running would suggest guilt, and Harold was not guilty of anything except compassion. The boy began to cry, and Harold was surprised by the depth of emotion. Little Hawk kept repeating words that Harold eventually understood meant he was sorry. The child felt responsible for bringing this danger to Harold, and that burden was too heavy for his young shoulders. Harold pulled the boy into a gentle hug, careful of his injuries, and let him cry. He spoke softly about Margaret and about how she had always said that love and kindness were never mistakes, even when they led to difficult places. After a while, Little Hawk calmed down, and Harold helped him get ready for the day. He changed the bandages one more time and helped the boy wash his face and hands. He found a crutch that he had made from spare parts the day before and showed Little Hawk how to use it. The boy was weak but determined, and he practiced moving around the room until he could manage a few steps without too much pain. At 6 in the morning, the first sun began to rise over the horizon. Harold stood at his window and watched as the campfires were extinguished one by one. In the growing light, he could see the true scale of the Apache force. They filled the hills in every direction, thousands of warriors in traditional dress mixed with modern armor. They carried weapons both ancient and advanced, and their faces were painted for war. It was the most terrifying and beautiful sight Harold had ever seen. Little Hawk insisted on standing beside Harold despite his injuries. He leaned heavily on his crutch, but his young face was set with determination. He said something in Apache that Harold did not understand, but the tone was clear. The boy would face his people with Harold, and he would tell the truth. Harold opened his front door and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and carried the scent of desert sage. Little Hawk hobbled out beside him, and they stood together on the small porch of the homestead. Before them stretched an army of 1,000 Apache warriors standing in perfect formation. The silence was absolute, and Harold could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. From the center of the formation, a figure began to walk forward. He was tall even by Apache standards, and he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. His armor was decorated with symbols that Harold recognized as denoting high rank, and his face was painted with intricate patterns. As he got closer, Harold could see the resemblance to Little Hawk in the shape of his eyes and the set of his jaw. This was the boy's father, and Harold understood now why so many warriors had come. The chief stopped about 20 feet from Harold's porch, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Harold kept his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. He was acutely aware that one wrong move could end his life and potentially spark a war. The chief's face was unreadable, and his dark eyes seemed to look straight through Harold into his soul. Little Hawk spoke first, calling out to his father in Apache. His voice was strong despite his injuries, and he gestured to Harold as he spoke. The boy talked for several minutes, and the chief listened without interrupting. Harold could not understand most of what was being said, but he heard his own name mentioned several times, along with words he had learned like medicine and help and kindness. When Little Hawk finished speaking, the silence returned. The chief looked from his son to Harold and back again. His expression had not changed, and Harold had no idea what the man was thinking. Behind the chief, the 1,000 warriors waited with perfect discipline. Not one of them moved or spoke. The tension was so thick that Harold felt like he could cut it with a knife. Then the chief spoke, and his voice carried across the morning air with authority. He addressed Harold directly in Apache, and though the old man did not understand every word, he recognized the tone of judgment. The chief continued speaking in Apache, and his voice rolled across the assembled warriors like thunder. Harold stood perfectly still, fighting the urge to look away from those penetrating dark eyes. He had read somewhere that in Apache culture, Looking away first was a sign of dishonor or guilt. So Harold held the chief's gaze even though every instinct told him to lower his eyes in respect. Little Hawk remained beside him, trembling slightly, either from pain or fear or both. From somewhere behind the chief, a younger warrior stepped forward. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the lean, muscular build of someone who spent his life training for combat. But his face held intelligence as well as strength, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and measured. He looked at Harold and spoke in accented but clear English. The translator said that War Chief Running Bear wished to understand what had happened to his son. He wanted to know why a human had taken Little Hawk and what Harold's intentions were. The translator's face was neutral, but Harold could hear the underlying threat in the words. This was not a casual inquiry, but a formal challenge. Harold's answer would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the fate of all human colonists on Chiricahua Prime. Harold took a breath and began to speak. He kept his voice steady and clear so that the translator could easily understand him. He explained that he had found Little Hawk collapsed near his water purifier at sunset 2 days ago. The boy had been badly wounded with plasma burns and a broken leg. Harold described how he had brought the child inside and treated his injuries to the best of his ability. He emphasized that Little Hawk had been dying and that leaving him would have been murder in Harold's eyes. The translator conveyed this to Running Bear, who listened without expression. When Harold finished, the chief asked another question through the translator. He wanted to know why Harold had not immediately contacted the Apache or returned the boy to his people. It was a fair question, and Harold had known it would come. Harold explained that Little Hawk had been too badly injured to move safely. The fever had been dangerously high, and moving him could have killed him. As for contacting the Apache, Harold admitted that he did not know how. He had studied their culture for decades, but he had never made direct contact. He had respected their desire for distance. He also admitted that he feared if he tried to approach their territory, they might shoot first and ask questions later. So he had done the only thing he could do, which was care for Little Hawk and hope that the boy's people would find them. The translator spoke to Running Bear again, and the chief's expression finally changed. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he asked another question. The translator turned to Harold and asked if he had expected a reward for saving Little Hawk. Had he planned to use the boy as leverage or to demand something from the Apache people? Harold felt anger flash through him for the first time since this confrontation began. The idea that he would use an injured child for personal gain was offensive to everything he believed. But he controlled his temper and spoke carefully. He said that he had expected nothing and wanted nothing except for Little Hawk to recover. He was a doctor by training, and his oath was to help those in need regardless of who they were or where they came from. He had saved Little Hawk because the boy was a child in pain, and that was reason enough. Little Hawk suddenly spoke up again, calling out to his father with urgency. The boy's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing to his bandaged wounds and to Harold. The translator listened and then turned to Running Bear. Whatever Little Hawk was saying, it was having an effect. The chief's face softened slightly, and he looked at his son with an expression that Harold recognized as paternal concern mixed with pride. The translator then did something unexpected. He stepped closer to Harold and spoke in a lower voice meant just for him. He said that Little Hawk was telling his father that Harold had treated him with great kindness and respect. The boy had been terrified at first, but Harold had been patient and gentle. He had fed Little Hawk and sung to him and taught him words in English. He had cared for him as if he were his own child. Little Hawk was insisting that Harold had saved his life not once but many times over the past 2 days. The translator stepped back and spoke loudly again so all could hear. He said that Running Bear wished to know about Harold himself. Who was this old human who lived alone on the edge of the desert? Why did he know so much about Apache culture and language? What was his purpose here? Harold decided that honesty was his only option. He explained that he was a xenobiologist who had spent his career studying the Apache people. He had always believed that humans and Apache could learn from each other and find common ground. His wife Margaret had shared this belief, and together they had documented Apache culture with respect and admiration. After Margaret died, Harold had stayed in his homestead because it was the home they had built together, and because he still hoped that one day there might be understanding between their peoples. He told them about his research and about the language program he had created. He admitted that he had never been brave enough to approach the Apache directly and had instead observed from a distance. He confessed that finding Little Hawk was the first time he had ever spoken to one of their people face to face. And he said that despite the danger, he was glad it had happened because it had given him a chance to prove that kindness could cross the boundaries of species and culture. When the translator finished conveying all this to Running Bear, the chief was silent for a long time. He looked at Harold with an expression that was impossible to read. The morning sun was fully up now and the heat was beginning to build. Harold felt sweat running down his back, but he did not move. The 1,000 warriors remained motionless, and Harold realized they had been standing in formation for hours without complaint. Their discipline was remarkable. Running Bear finally spoke again, and this time his voice carried a different tone. The translator's face showed surprise at whatever the chief had said. He turned to Harold and explained that by Apache law a life debt had been created. Harold had saved Little Hawk's life and asked for nothing in return. Such debts were sacred and ancient among the Apache people, dating back to their origins on their lost homeworld. The translator continued explaining that when a life debt was owed, it must be repaid 7 times over. The debtor's entire family shared in the obligation. But this debt was more complicated than most. Little Hawk was not just Running Bear's son. He was the designated heir who would one day lead the Apache people. By saving Little Hawk, Harold had not just saved one life, but had preserved the future of the entire nation. Harold felt his knees go weak at this revelation. He had not known who Little Hawk was beyond being a child in need. The weight of what the translator was describing pressed down on him like a physical force. He looked at Little Hawk, who gave him a small, encouraging smile despite his pain. Running Bear spoke again, and the translator's voice took on a formal tone. The chief was making a declaration that would be binding on all Apache. Harold Finch was hereby declared a friend of the Apache nation. Any who harmed Harold harmed all Apache. Any who aided Harold honored all Apache. The life debt was acknowledged and would be honored in ways that would be determined by the Council of Elders. But there was more. Running Bear raised his hand and the 1,000 warriors moved as one. They struck their spears against the ground in a rhythmic pattern that created a sound like rolling thunder. The chief spoke over this sound, and the translator had to raise his voice to be heard. Running Bear was ordering his warriors to maintain an honor guard around Harold's homestead for 3 days. This was a traditional gesture reserved for those who had earned the deepest respect of the Apache people. Harold did not know what to say. He had expected death or capture, or at best to be ignored. He had not expected this. He looked at Running Bear and saw that the chief was watching him closely. There was still wariness in those eyes, but also something that might have been the beginning of respect. Harold bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement and thanks because he could not find the words in any language. Little Hawk hobbled forward on his crutch and embraced his father. Running Bear held his son carefully, mindful of his injuries, and for a moment, the great war chief looked like nothing more than a father grateful to have his child alive. When they separated running, Bear placed his hand on Harold's shoulder in a gesture that clearly meant something significant, because the warriors responded with another unified strike of their spears against the ground. The translator smiled for the first time and told Harold that he had just been given the highest honor an outsider could receive from the Apache people. Running Bear gestured for Harold to sit, and the old man gratefully lowered himself onto the steps of his porch. His legs had been shaking for the past 20 minutes, and he was relieved to take the weight off them. Little Hawk sat beside him, still gripping his crutch and looking up at his father with a mixture of pride and nervousness. The translator remained standing and continued to serve as the voice between the two men. The war chief began to explain the ancient law of life debts in more detail. He spoke slowly so that the translator could convey each point clearly to Harold. According to Apache tradition, when someone saved another's life at great personal risk, a sacred bond was created between them. This bond extended beyond the two individuals to include their families and their clans. It was considered one of the most serious obligations in Apache society, and breaking it would bring dishonor that lasted for generations. The translator explained that life debts could be repaid in many ways depending on the circumstances. Sometimes it meant protection or resources or teaching. Sometimes it meant alliance or adoption into the clan. The specific terms were usually decided through discussion and mutual agreement. But in this case, the debt was complicated by several factors that made it unprecedented in recent Apache history. First Little Hawk was the son of the war chief and the heir to leadership. His life had value beyond the personal because his future decisions would affect all Apache people. Second, Harold was human and not Apache, which made the traditional methods of repayment difficult to apply. Third, Harold had not saved Little Hawk as part of some calculated political move, but out of simple decency, which made the debt even more profound in Apache. Running Bear spoke again, and the translator conveyed his words with obvious importance. The chief was declaring that Harold's action had proven something the Apache had long doubted. It had proven that humans were capable of seeing Apache as people rather than obstacles. It had proven that compassion could exist across species boundaries. And it had proven that perhaps peace between their peoples was possible if others could follow Harold's example. Harold listened to all this with growing amazement. He had not thought beyond saving a dying child. He had not considered the political implications or the cultural significance. He had simply done what his conscience demanded and what his medical training had prepared him for. Yet somehow that simple act had opened a door that decades of formal diplomacy had failed to budge. The translator told Harold that Running Bear wished to know more about human culture and human intentions on Chiricahua Prime. This was clearly an opportunity for dialogue that had not existed before. Harold took a deep breath and tried to organize his thoughts. He wanted to be honest but also diplomatic. He did not speak for all humans any more than Running Bear spoke for all Apache, but he could share his own perspective. Harold explained that most human colonists had come to Chiricahua Prime seeking a new life. They were farmers and merchants and craftspeople who wanted land and opportunity. Many of them did not understand Apache culture and saw the vast territories held by relatively few Apache as wasteful. But Harold also said that ignorance was not the same as malice. Most humans simply did not know better and had never been. Given the chance to learn, he talked about his own research and his belief that the Apache had much to teach humans about living in harmony with harsh environments. Their technology was different from human technology, but equally sophisticated in its own way. Their social structures emphasized community and honor in ways that humans had largely lost. Harold admitted that he had always admired Apache culture from afar and had dreamed of the day when the two species might share knowledge freely. Running Bear listened carefully to all this, and when Harold finished, the chief asked a pointed question through the translator. He wanted to know if Harold spoke for the human government. Did the leaders of New Mesa share his views, or was he an anomaly among his people? Harold answered honestly that he did not speak for anyone but himself. The colonial government was cautious and concerned primarily with security and economic growth. There were some like Governor Hayes who genuinely wanted peace, but there were others who saw the Apache as primitive and in the way of progress. Harold admitted that changing those attitudes would take time and effort, and probably many more gestures like the one happening right now. The translator conveyed this, and Running Bear nodded slowly. He seemed to appreciate Harold's honesty, even if the answer was not entirely encouraging. The chief then made a surprising proposal. He wanted to invite human representatives to come to Harold's homestead under the protection of the honor guard. He wanted to begin formal discussions about how the two peoples might coexist more peacefully. And he wanted Harold to serve as a mediator since he had proven himself trustworthy. Harold was stunned by this suggestion. He was not a diplomat or a politician. He was a retired scientist who had stumbled into this situation by accident. But looking at Running Bear's serious face and at Little Hawk's hopeful expression, he realized he could not refuse. This was the opportunity he had dreamed about for decades. If he said no, it might never come again. He agreed to serve as mediator, but asked for one condition. He wanted both sides to approach the discussions with genuine openness and willingness to compromise. He would not be a tool for either side to manipulate. He would speak truth as he saw it, even if that truth was uncomfortable. Running Bear considered this and then agreed. The translator said the chief respected Harold's integrity and would honor his independence. With that settled, Running Bear gave orders to his warriors. They began to spread out around Harold's homestead in organized groups. Some set up temporary shelters while others established perimeter positions. Still others began unloading supplies from hidden caches that they had apparently brought with them. The honor guard was not just symbolic but practical. They would be staying for 3 days, and they came prepared. Harold invited Running Bear and the translator into his home. Little Hawk came too, refusing to be separated from either his father or Harold. Inside the modest homestead, the war chief looked around with interest. He examined Harold's research materials and his old photographs and his simple furnishings. The translator explained that Running Bear was impressed by how simply Harold lived. For someone who had studied Apache culture so extensively, he had not accumulated wealth or sought power. This aligned with Apache values of humility and service. Harold made tea using leaves from a local plant that he knew both species could consume safely. They sat around his small kitchen table, and for a while they simply drank in companionable silence. Little Hawk leaned against his father, clearly exhausted from the morning's events, but refusing to rest. Harold could see the strong bond between father and son, and it reminded him of his own relationship with Claire. As they talked through the translator, Harold learned more about Apache society. Running Bear explained that his people had been on Chiricahua Prime for over 300 years. They had shaped themselves to this world and it to them. Their technology used biological processes and sustainable energy because they remembered what industrial excess had done to their original homeworld. They held territory lightly, knowing that the land belonged to itself and not to any people. They valued honor and courage because survival in harsh environments required both. Harold in turn explained human history and the mistakes his species had made on Earth. He talked about environmental destruction and wars, and the slow, painful process of learning to do better. He admitted that humans still had much to learn about living sustainably and peacefully, but he also insisted that humans were capable of growth and change when given the chance. Running Bear asked about Margaret, and Harold found himself sharing stories about his wife. He explained how they had met at university, and how she had convinced him to specialize in xenobiology. He described their early years of research and their decision to come to Chiricahua Prime. He talked about her illness and death and how much he still missed her every day. The translator conveyed all this, and Harold saw something soften in Running Bear's face. The chief spoke about his own wife who had died in childbirth with Little Hawk. He described the pain of raising a son alone and the weight of knowing that son would one day lead their people. He talked about the fear he felt when Little Hawk went on his trial of manhood, and the greater fear when the boy did not return on schedule. Finding Little Hawk alive and healing in Harold's care had been the greatest relief of his life. The two fathers sat together, sharing their grief and their love for their children. The translator spoke quietly, keeping his voice respectful of the emotions in the room. Little Hawk dozed off in his chair with his head on the table, and both men smiled at the sight. In that moment they were not human and Apache or war chief and scientist. They were simply two old men who had lived and loved and lost, and who understood each other in ways that transcended species. Running Bear stood to leave, and Harold walked him to the door. The chief placed both hands on Harold's shoulders and spoke directly to him in Apache. Harold did not need the translator to understand the meaning. It was a gesture of respect and gratitude and friendship. Harold returned the gesture as best he could, and the two men stood there for a moment. 3 months had passed since the morning when 1,000 warriors had surrounded Harold's homestead, and the world of Chiricahua Prime had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Harold stood at the window of his new dwelling in the Apache capital of Canyon of Echoes, watching the sun rise over the red rock formations. The view was breathtaking and very different from his old homestead, but he had come to love it. The dwelling was built in the traditional Apache style, with living walls made from a bioengineered material that regulated temperature naturally, and windows that faced the sacred directions. Little Hawk visited him every morning without fail. The boy's injuries had healed completely, leaving only faint scars that he wore with pride. He had completed his trial of manhood in a modified form approved by the elders, and was now considered a warrior in training. But he still made time for Harold, teaching him more of the Apache language and learning more English in return. Their friendship had deepened over the months, and Harold had come to think of Little Hawk almost as a grandson. This morning Little Hawk arrived early, carrying fresh bread from the communal ovens and honey from the canyon hives. They sat together eating breakfast and talking about the progress at the Friendship Academy. The school had opened 6 weeks ago with 20 students, half human and half Apache. Harold taught classes 3 times a week on xenobiology and comparative cultures. Apache instructors taught desert survival and sustainable technology. The students were enthusiastic and curious, and Harold found teaching them more rewarding than anything he had done in his long career. Harold's daughter Claire had moved to Chiricahua Prime with her husband and their 2 children. She had taken a position at the academy teaching human literature and history. At first she had been shocked by the change in her father. The isolated, grieving man she had last visited 2 years ago was gone, replaced by someone engaged and energized and surrounded by purpose. Claire had been skeptical about the whole situation, but after meeting Little Hawk and Running Bear and seeing the academy in action, she had become one of its strongest supporters. Theo, joint council that Harold had helped establish, was meeting regularly now. Progress was slow, and there were still tensions and disagreements. Some human colonists resented what they saw as favoritism toward the Apache. Some Apache warriors believed their people were compromising too much. But the council kept meeting and kept talking, and gradually small agreements were reached. Water rights and disputed territories were negotiated. Trade routes were established. Cultural exchange programs were created. It was not perfect, but it was movement in the right direction. Harold's old homestead had been preserved as a historical site, just as Running Bear had promised. Both human and Apache visitors came to see the place where peace had begun. There were plans to turn it into a museum with exhibits about human-Apache relations and the life debt that had changed everything. Harold had donated his research materials and personal belongings to the project. The spare room where Little Hawk had recovered was kept exactly as it had been, with the faded quilt and the bandages and the medical kit that Harold had used. Running Bear had become one of Harold's closest friends. Despite their differences in age and culture, the war chief visited often, and they would sit together for hours discussing philosophy and politics and the challenges of building peace. Running Bear confided in Harold about the pressures he faced from the more militant members of his council, who believed humans could never be trusted. Harold shared his own frustrations with human colonists who saw the Apache as primitive or in the way. Together they strategized about how to win hearts and minds on both sides. The translator, whose name was Swift River, had also become a regular presence in Harold's life. The young warrior had a gift for languages and a passion for bridge building. He had taken a position at the academy teaching Apache language to human students and English to Apache students. Swift River told Harold that he had always believed peace was possible, but had never thought he would see it in his lifetime. Now he was helping to create it, and that gave his life meaning. Harold's health had improved somewhat with access to better medical care. The Apache physicians had treatments that human medicine did not, and they had generously shared them with Harold. He would never be young again, and his body still ached in the mornings, but he had more energy than he had felt in years. He attributed this partly to the treatments, but mostly to having a reason to get up each day. Purpose was powerful medicine. Little Hawk was thriving under his father's guidance and Harold's mentorship. The boy had matured noticeably over the past 3 months, showing wisdom beyond his years. He spoke often about wanting to lead his people toward greater cooperation with humans when his time came. He understood that change would be slow and that there would be resistance. But he also believed that the example set by his father and Harold proved that different peoples could respect and learn from each other. One afternoon, Running Bear invited Harold to attend a gathering of Apache clan leaders from across the region. It was a great honor for a human to be included in such a meeting. Harold sat quietly listening as the leaders discussed various issues facing their people. When the topic turned to human relations, Running Bear asked Harold to speak. Harold stood nervously before these powerful leaders and shared his perspective. He talked about the importance of patience and understanding. He acknowledged the legitimate grievances the Apache had against human encroachment. But he also insisted that most humans were not enemies but potential friends if given the chance to prove themselves. One clan leader, whose name meant Stoneface, challenged Harold directly. He asked why the Apache should trust humans when human history was filled with broken promises and betrayal. Harold did not shy away from the question. He admitted that human history was indeed troubled, and that trust had to be earned, not demanded. But he pointed out that judging all humans by past failures was like judging all Apache by their worst individuals. Every person deserved to be met as an individual and given the chance to show their character. He had trusted Little Hawk, and Little Hawk had trusted him, and that trust had opened doors that seemed permanently locked. Stoneface considered this, and then nodded slowly. He said that Harold's words had weight because his actions had proven his sincerity. Other leaders voiced similar sentiments. By the end of the gathering, the council had voted to expand the cultural exchange programs and to invite more human participation in Apache festivals and ceremonies. It was another small step, but small steps led to long journeys. Harold received a message from Earth that month from a colleague he had not spoken to in years. The news of what had happened on Chiricahua Prime had spread through academic circles and beyond. Harold was being hailed as a hero and a pioneer in xenodiplomacy. Universities wanted to offer him honorary degrees. Media outlets wanted interviews. Government officials wanted to consult with him about first contact protocols. Harold politely declined most of these requests. He was not interested in fame or recognition. He was interested in the work, and the work was here on Chiricahua Prime, not on Earth. But he did agree to write about his experiences for an academic journal. He spent several weeks composing an article about the life debt and its implications for interspecies relations. He argued that formal diplomacy often failed because it focused on abstract concepts like territory and resources. Real peace came from personal connections and shared humanity, even when the beings involved were not technically human. His article was published and became required reading in xenology programs across human space. The anniversary of Little Hawk's rescue arrived, and both communities organized a celebration. It was held at the site where the Friendship Academy was being built, though construction was still ongoing. Hundreds of humans and Apache gathered together for speeches and music and shared food. Harold was asked to speak, and he kept his remarks brief. He thanked everyone for their commitment to peace and urged them to remember that the work was never finished. Every day required new choices and new acts of kindness and courage. Little Hawk also spoke, and his words moved many in the crowd. He talked about lying in Harold's spare room thinking he would die far from his family. He described waking to find a stranger caring for him with gentle hands and kind words. He said that Harold had saved his body, but more importantly, he had saved Little Hawk's belief that different peoples could care for each other. That belief was now guiding Little Hawk's life and would guide his leadership when the time came. Running Bear closed the ceremony with a traditional blessing. He called upon the spirits of the land and the ancestors to watch over this new alliance between peoples. He declared that the life debt to Harold Finch would be honored for 7 generations and beyond, and he proclaimed that from this day forward the anniversary would be celebrated as Unity Day, a reminder of what was possible when compassion overcame fear. As the celebration continued with music and dancing, Harold found a quiet spot to sit and watch. Claire came and sat beside him with her youngest child asleep in her arms. She told him that she was proud of what he had accomplished, and that her mother would have been proud too. Harold felt emotion tighten his throat. The 3 days of the honor guard transformed Harold's quiet homestead into the center of something unprecedented. Word had spread quickly through both human and Apache communities about what had happened. The story of an old man saving a child and the massive response from the Apache warriors had captured imaginations on both sides. Within hours of Running Bear's declaration, Governor Patricia Hayes had contacted Harold requesting permission to visit under the protection of the honor guard. Harold found himself in the strange position of hosting diplomatic meetings in his small home. The first day he met with Governor Hayes and her senior advisors. Patricia was a practical woman in her 50s, who had spent the last 10 years trying to keep peace between the human colonists and the Apache. She arrived with a small security detail, but Running Bear had them wait outside the perimeter while Patricia and 2 advisors came to Harold's door. The meeting was awkward at first. Patricia sat at Harold's kitchen table across from Running Bear with the translator between them. Harold sat at the head of the table feeling like an intruder in his own home. But as they began to talk, the tension slowly eased. Patricia explained that the human colony wanted peaceful relations with the Apache, but that there were practical concerns about land use and resource access. Running Bear listened and then explained that the Apache were willing to discuss boundaries, but that humans needed to understand that the land was not just property to be divided. Harold found himself mediating when the conversation became heated. He reminded both sides that they were here because a child had been saved, and that the compassion shown in that act should guide their discussions. He pointed out areas where human technology and Apache sustainability practices could complement each other. He suggested pilot programs where both peoples could work together on environmental projects. Some of his ideas were practical and some were idealistic, but they All came from a genuine desire to build bridges. The end of the first day, Patricia and Running Bear had agreed to establish a joint council that would meet monthly to discuss issues of mutual concern. It was a small step, but it was more progress than had been made in 30 years. Patricia shook Harold's hand before leaving and told him that he had done more for human-Apache relations in 3 days than all the formal diplomats had done in 3 decades. The second day brought a different kind of visitor. Apache elders arrived wanting to meet the human who had saved their future chief. They were ancient by any standard, with faces lined by centuries of desert sun and eyes that seemed to see through to the soul. They sat with Harold in his garden and asked him questions about human culture and beliefs. Harold answered as honestly as he could, talking about human diversity and human failures and human hopes. One elder, whose name translated to gray sky, asked Harold why he had chosen to live alone on the edge of the desert. Harold explained about Margaret and about his research and about his desire for quiet after a lifetime of work. Gray Sky nodded and said that the Apache understood the value of solitude. Many of their wisest leaders spent years alone in the desert learning from the silence, but Gray Sky also said that Harold's solitude was ending. He had been pulled into the stream of history and there was no going back. The elders performed a ceremony in Harold's garden that afternoon. They sang songs in the old Apache language and burned herbs that filled the air with sweet smoke. The translator explained that they were blessing Harold's home and thanking the spirits for bringing their people together. Harold stood quietly during the ceremony, feeling the weight of tradition and the hope of new beginnings. Little Hawk participated despite his injuries, and Harold could see how much this meant to the boy. That evening, human colonists began to arrive, curious about the Apache warriors camped around Harold's homestead. Running Bear had given permission for peaceful visits, and small groups of humans walked up tentatively to the perimeter. The Apache warriors were initially standoffish, but as the hours passed, conversations began to happen. A human farmer asked about Apache irrigation techniques. An Apache warrior asked about human medical technology. A human child approached Little Hawk and asked about his injuries, and the two children ended up sitting together drawing pictures in the dirt. Harold watched these interactions from his porch and felt something like joy blooming in his chest. This was what Margaret had always envisioned. People of different worlds finding common ground through simple human connection. The barriers were not gone, but they were beginning to crack, and light was shining through the gaps. The third day brought the most surprising development of all. A group of young Apache warriors approached Harold with a proposal. They wanted to learn from him about human science and medicine. In exchange, they would teach him and any interested humans about Apache survival skills and sustainable technology. They suggested creating a school where both peoples could learn from each other. Harold was overwhelmed by the idea, but also excited. He had always been a teacher at heart, and this was a chance to teach in a way that truly mattered. Running Bear approved the proposal, and Patricia Hayes agreed to provide resources from the colony. They decided to call it the Friendship Academy, and to build it at a location between the human settlement and the Apache territories. Harold would serve as the first director with a council of both human and Apache educators to help run it. The academy would start small with just a few students, but the dream was to expand it over time. Little Hawk's injuries were healing, well, thanks to both Harold's initial treatment and the advanced Apache healing methods that Running Bear's personal physician had applied. The boy was walking without a crutch now, though he still tired easily. He spent much of the third day with Harold talking about the future. Little Hawk said that when he became chief, he would remember this time and work to maintain the peace that his father and Harold had started. Harold told him that being a good leader meant listening more than talking and caring for all people, not just your own. Little Hawk promised to remember that. On the evening of the third day, Running Bear announced that the honor guard would be leaving at dawn. He gathered all the warriors together along with the human visitors who had stayed to watch. He gave a speech that the translator conveyed to the humans. Running Bear said that what had happened here was a gift from the spirits. An old human had shown them that kindness was not weakness and that different peoples could care for each other. The Apache would honor the life debt to Harold Finch for as long as their nation existed. More importantly, they would honor the spirit of what he had done by working toward lasting peace. With the human colonists, the warriors struck their spears against the ground in that thunderous rhythm that Harold had heard 3 days before, but this time the sound felt less threatening and more celebratory. The humans who were present began to clap along with the rhythm, and soon both peoples were making noise together in a strange but beautiful harmony. Harold stood on his porch with Little Hawk beside him and felt tears running down his face. Margaret would have loved this moment. That night, Harold could not sleep despite his exhaustion. He sat in his garden under the stars thinking about everything that had changed. 3 days ago, he had been a lonely old man waiting for death in quiet isolation. Now he was at the center of a movement toward peace and understanding. He had a purpose again and friends from 2 different species. His home had become a symbol of hope, and his simple act of compassion had rippled out in ways he never could have imagined. Little Hawk found him there in the garden, unable to sleep himself. The boy sat down beside Harold, and they looked up at the unfamiliar constellations together. Little Hawk asked Harold if he was happy. Harold thought about the question carefully before answering. He said that happiness was complicated and that he still missed Margaret every day. But yes, he was happy, because he was finally seeing the dream they had shared begin to come true. He was happy because he had found purpose in his final years. And he was happy because he had gained a friend in Little Hawk. The boy smiled and leaned his head against Harold's shoulder. They sat like that for a long time under the stars of Chiricahua Prime, 2 souls from different worlds connected by circumstance and compassion. The future was uncertain and there would be challenges ahead. But in that moment, everything felt possible, and hope seemed like more than just a word.